In May 1993, three young Arkansas boys, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, went missing.
Three little Cub Scouts, hog-tied and left in an Arkansas ditch.
One of the most controversial legal cases in the state's history. A jury found the man guilty of murdering the 8-year-old boys back in 1993 in what prosecutors at the time had called some sort of a satanic ritual.
The celebrities fighting for the teens' release claimed the kids were railroaded because of their mullets, dark clothes, and fascination with the occult.
Sickening killings that might have been part of a satanic ritual.
Convicted murderers Jason Baldwin, Jesse Misskelley, and Damian Eccles are now free men. They spent 17 years in prison for a crime that stunned Arkansas.
The West Memphis Three would be allowed to walk out of prison, but prosecutors agreed to sign off on the deal only if the defendants would plead guilty.
A long time on death row for something that you insist you didn't do.
There's always the possibility that the person that you're killing is innocent.
This is Wrongful Conviction. Welcome back to Wrongful Conviction. Today I have a special show for you, and I think it's going to be a real treat because with me I have a guy who has done profound work in film dealing with wrongful convictions. I'm super excited to have him here to share some stories and some wisdom and his outlook. So, Joe Berlinger, welcome to Wrongful Conviction.
Jason, thanks. I'm a big fan of the podcast and a fan of you, so I'm glad to be here. In fact, it amazes me that since I consider myself a music and wrongful conviction guy, and you're an amazing music and wrongful conviction guy, I'm amazed we haven't met until recently, which is why this podcast came to be. We shared a nice dinner together.
Yeah, we had dinner recently with Damian Eccles and Amanda Knox, and so we really connected, and it's interesting because I do sort of music and justice. You do film, music, and justice.
Yes.
And the thing that you've been known for was your movie about the West Memphis Three, because it was such an important, not only such an important documentary, but also such an important moment in the changing of the perception of the American public and the worldwide public as to how these things happen. And I'm interested to know, how did you, because you and I both were in criminal justice reform before it was sort of a thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we were early adopters.
Yeah.
And I like to say we were in it before it was cool, but that sounds ridiculous. But anyway.
That's true.
Listen, I'm glad it's cool because we need more and more people.
Can't have enough storytellers shining a light on injustice and activists trying to change this miserable system we have.
No, we need an army. And so you made this remarkable Paradise Lost trilogy that I'm holding in my hand right now, which told the story of the three kids, and they were kids, they were teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Misskelley, who were persecuted, prosecuted, arrested, tried, convicted for one of the most gruesome and notorious triple murders in the history of the world.
Yeah.
The 3 8-year-old boys that went missing in West Memphis, Arkansas,
Yep.
out riding their bikes and turned up in a riverbank, tortured, brutally assaulted, sexually mutilated, and, of course, dead. And how did it come to be that, and we'll get into how the wrongful conviction happened, but how did you go from being a filmmaker to being this guy? And how were you made aware of this case, and how did you get involved? And boy, it's a good thing you did, or Damian would have been executed by now.
Yeah, it's amazing, and thank you for all that. That's very kind of you to say, because you've also done amazing work, which I appreciate. My first film, which I should say Paradise Lost and Brothers Keeper, were made with Bruce Sinofsky, who recently passed away. So if I revert to the eyes, I always mean we. But, we had made Brothers Keeper, which there was no sense of social justice behind the making of that movie. That was purely an aesthetic exercise to push the documentary form a little further. There was a handful of filmmakers in the late 80s, early 90s that were looking to expand what it means to be a documentary. Errol Morris did it with Thin Blue Line, but his contribution, besides the wrongful conviction aspect, was, pushing recreations to a whole new level. Michael Moore was pushing documentary by, the filmmaker as on-camera curmudgeon, crusading for a social cause. That was new. Morgan Spurlock then picked up that kind of thread and others. What we were trying to do with Brothers Keeper was simply, by using a murder trial, because it has perfect dramatic structure, is to take the documentary and create just a film that feels like a narrative film because of how it's shot, how it's edited, how it looks, how it's structured, and to push the documentary form. I had no interest in social justice, no interest in wrongful I didn't even know wrongful convictions took place back then. I was very naive about the justice system. And Brothers Keeper was very successful. And so Sheila Nevins from HBO came a-calling. She was, until very recently, the head of documentaries at HBO for, 3 decades. And if I had to pick one person responsible for expanding the form to what it is today, Sheila would be that woman. But she also likes salacious material. And so she read this story about 3 devil-worshipping teens who were just been arrested for these horrible crimes. And she wanted a satanic kids killing kids movie because it seemed like that was the case. So 1 week after the arrests of the 3, of course they weren't called the West Memphis 3 back then. They were these rotten teenagers accused of these horrible crimes. We went down to West Memphis, Arkansas in June of 93, thinking we were making a film about kids killing kids. All the press was saying they were guilty. Jessie Misskelley's confession without any context, the multiple statements over time were reduced to a digestible paragraph without context published in the local paper. So we thought there was a confession. The prosecution and the police were saying at press conferences on a scale of 1 to 10, this is an 11. I was going down as a filmmaker coming off of a really great experience on my first film of pushing the form of documentary, but no idea of social justice. We go down, we embed with the families of the victims mainly. The trial is still 7 months away. For the first 3 months of the project, we really spent time with the families of the victims. And of course, they hated these guys and thought they were, the devil. And we had no reason to believe otherwise.
On season 7 of Wrongful Conviction, on the 5th episode, I interviewed Damien Echols. Here's an excerpt. You were an outcast, right? Mm-hmm. And there were these very small-minded people around who sort of came to this instinctual, call it, conclusion that it must be the weird kid, right? It must be the kid that wears black and listens to heavy metal. And this was during the Satanic Panic as well, right?
Yes.
Back then.
Yeah.
For those of you who are old enough to remember, in the early 90s, there was this very strange thing that was going on in America, with rumors of satanic cults and stuff like that. None of them turned out to be true, but that's beside the point. So what happened?
For me, my entire life, the thing that has been most important to me, that I love the most, that my life always sort of revolved around, was Western Hermeticism, ceremonial magic, all the way back from when I was a child. But I lived in a incredibly right-wing fundamentalist town where, there are places in this town where you come to a 4-corner stop, and on all 4 corners of the street will be churches.
That's like Starbucks now.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was like. And if you didn't belong to, one of these mainstream, for that area mainstream, fundamentalist religions, you were automatically viewed as suspicious. You were satanic. That's what they thought. And it didn't matter if you were a Buddhist or a Hindu or something like that. You're still satanic. You just don't know you're a Satanist. You're just being, tricked by the devil into thinking there's some other religion. The fact that I actually did love ceremonial magic, and that's been one of their things that, they harp on forever, that is Satanism. So that was a huge part of what made them focus on me as well. That was what they thought made me a freak. They think automatically you're a Satanist. It would take a Satanist to commit a crime like this, stick all those things together, and they didn't even look for anybody or anything else.
So in this case, they focused on you, and then they had to find a way to get to you, yes. Right? Because there was no evidence connecting you.
No.
So they found a way. And that way was Jessie Misskelley.
Exactly.
So they originally sort of tricked him into confessing, and he immediately recanted after he confessed.
He had an IQ of somewhere between 70 and 72, and they interrogated him. I can't remember exactly how many hours it was. It was something like between 12 and 14 hours, and they're telling this guy who, has an IQ that's way, way below normal, they're telling him things like, just tell us what we want to know and we'll let you go home. So they finally get this guy to confess, and he can't get anything about the crime scene right because he wasn't actually there, so he didn't know anything. They didn't care. The only thing they cared about was the fact that they got him to say yes.
And we also know, Damien, that people who are most susceptible to this are adolescents.
Yes.
We now know that the human brain isn't fully formed until you're 25. He was 16, right? 17, and with this low IQ, he was totally outmatched, overwhelmed, and probably after 12 to 14 hours, he would have confessed to
anything,
killing Abraham Lincoln.
Exactly.
I mean, just to go home. So he implicated you and Jason. So Jason was sort of your one and best and pretty much only friend at the time,
exactly.
Right? And he was just physical appearances. He didn't have the same stigma that you did, right? He was
Right.
sort of just an average-looking kid, very young-looking.
Yeah.
Must have weighed 100 pounds or less.
Yep.
Didn't look like a killer.
Right.
But to them, you did.
Exactly.
And he got caught up in all of this, too.
Yep, just because he knew me.
Right. Unbelievable. On Season 2 of Wrongful Conviction, Episode 8, I interviewed Jason Baldwin. Here's what he had to say.
And so when the police came, honestly, it didn't really scare me or alarm me because I figured they were going everywhere. I figured it was door to door, that they were talking to everybody they could, And to me, that made sense. That was logical. But what I didn't know that they were targeting us.
So now everything goes completely haywire and you guys get arrested.
Correct. They mugshotted me, but when they fingerprinted me, they didn't stop there. They took a fingerprint. They took an entire hand impression. They took my entire footprints, right? And then they took me to the hospital and they took hair samples. They took saliva samples. They took blood samples. When they were taking these samples from me, it gave me hope because I thought, okay, whoever committed this crime, they've left something for the police to compare my samples to, right? And so that's where my hope was. And now at this point, I had already been engaged with the police and they had asked me, questions and stuff, and I had told them where I was at, and they absolutely refused the truth. They kept telling me, no, we've got another story. Your friend has told us that you have done this and that what you're telling us is not true. I'm like, well, who is this friend? And they refused to tell me. The boys' bodies were found May the 6th. We were arrested June 3rd. Jesse Misskelley gave the false confession on June 3rd. But what many people have not really noticed that on May the 15th, just a couple of weeks after the boys' bodies were found, Jesse went to the police with another friend because there was a tip line and a reward offered out for any information on who may have committed this crime. Now, Jesse did not know who committed this crime, but he wanted the reward money. He was imagining the brand new truck he could buy his father and things like that. So him and another kid out of his trailer park went to the police and said, there's this suspicious guy in the town that, you need to check out. And I don't know exactly what all he told them about this guy or whatever, but they ended up telling him, Jesse, you need to come back with a more believable story than that. Right? A few weeks go by. Now they're saying they've got that believable story when he gives the false confession against Damien and me.
Then we finally negotiated access. They were all in county jail awaiting trial. And somehow we taught, documentary was a little more naive in those days in terms of people's perceptions. And so we were able, one of the amazing things about Paradise Lost is just where we stuck our camera. We got tremendous access, which I don't think we'd ever get today, luckily for all involved. But we finally negotiated access to the West Memphis 3. And again, they weren't called that then. And we did our first series of interviews. And I think I'm sitting down with killers, horrible kids wanting to understand how 3 teens could be so disaffected from life that they would do this horrible thing. There were some killings in the UK on railroad tracks just a few years before, the Jamie Bolger case that actually I had tried to get access to and make a film about. So my head is kids killing kids. It's a trend. Let's make a film about it. Of course, the late 80s was the whole satanic panic and satanic hysteria. I was a young filmmaker and, didn't have any reason to think that wasn't necessarily true. So I went into this project, and the great irony is that, 2 decades and 3 films later, this crusade to get these guys out started off as, let's make a film about these rotten punks. So we sit down, we do our first series of interviews. Honestly, Damien was a little hard to read. I look back now, obviously he was in shock. He didn't believe he would actually be convicted. But he was a little hard to read because he seemed to be enjoying the attention, which was an odd dynamic. Not to be judgmental. Damien's a hero to me who's gone through the most amazing journey. But that first interview, I couldn't quite tell with him. But the person who really just whatever sense of tapping into something that I had at the time, it was talking to Jason Baldwin, where I just said, this doesn't add up. 4 months before the trial, 3 months into being embedded in West Memphis, Arkansas, because we spent literally 7 months camping out there before the trial started.